Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast that explores how recent discoveries in neuroscience are helping unravel the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I am your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 198. This is our second and final encore episode for the year, featuring philosopher Evan Thompson. Early in his career, Thompson was one of the co-authors of the groundbreaking book, The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience, which is still considered a foundational text for the embodied cognition movement. In this interview, we talked about his follow-up book, Mind in Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Sciences of Mind, in which he explored the so-called explanatory gap between biological life and consciousness. If you're new to brain science, please don't panic. First of all, I think you will appreciate Thompson's unique background and the perspective he brings to the question of how a brain could possibly generate something like consciousness. We will be talking more about embodied cognition in an upcoming episode, so I chose this episode to introduce the subject to new listeners and to provide a refresher for longtime fans. The transcript for this episode is also free. Before we jump into the interview, I want to remind you that you can get complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com, and you can send me email at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. You can also get show notes automatically each month when you sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter. You can sign up at brainsciencepodcast.com or just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. When you sign up, you also get a free gift entitled 5 Things You Need to Know About Your Brain. Because Brain Science is independently produced, it relies on the support of listeners like you. Learn more at brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. I'll be back after the interview to review the key ideas and to share a few brief announcements. Evan, I want to welcome you to the Brain Science Podcast. I've gotten lots of requests to have you on the show, so I know my listeners are in for a treat.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to join you on the show.
Perhaps you could start out just by telling us a little bit about your background.
Well, my background is principally in philosophy. That my PhD is in philosophy. But I actually started out as an undergraduate in Asian studies. So my first degree, my bachelor's degree from Amherst College, was in Asian studies, and I studied Chinese history and Chinese language and Chinese philosophy. Well, really Asian philosophy overall, with a focus on Buddhist philosophy. And that's actually what led me into my interest in philosophy. I went in the other direction from the way some people usually go, going from east to west rather than from west to east. So I decided to go to graduate school in philosophy. And when I was a graduate student, I really got drawn into philosophy of mind and cognitive science. This was in the early 1980s. These were areas that were really emerging into prominence in philosophy. There was a lot of excitement, and so I got pulled into that. And that's really what I've been working on ever since, though I've certainly kept an interest in other areas. I still work a lot with Asian philosophical traditions, doing what now today is called cross-cultural philosophy. So I try to, cover a number of different areas. But my sort of home base, you could say, is philosophy of cognitive science.
Well, I certainly identify with that because I spent a lot of time myself reading Eastern thought before I ever came around to Western philosophy. And then I discovered philosophy of mind, and that brought me back to neuroscience and kind of indirectly led to this podcast. So we have something in common there. So you chose to go ahead and go to graduate school and study philosophy. When did you come into contact with Francisco Varela?
Well, that's an interesting parallel story in a way. I first met him through my father, William Irwin Thompson, who is a writer. And I met him in the mid-1970s when I was about 14 or 15. My father had founded an organization called the Lindisfarne Association, And this was an organization that brought together scientists and philosophers and artists and ecologists and political activists. It was a very eclectic group of people. And he organized a conference with Gregory Bateson, who was also a friend of his, and an anthropologist, and in many ways you could say a kind of proto-cognitive scientist.
Right.
Francisco Varela came to one of the conferences that my father organized, and so I met him at that point. And then he came and lived with us at the institute that my father was running. And so he really was a family friend from my early teenage years. Then when I was in graduate school, this would have been around 1986, he had just moved to Paris where he was taking up a position in neuroscience. And he had a long-standing interest in Buddhist philosophy, and he wanted to write a book bringing together his interests in Buddhist philosophy and neuroscience and cognitive science. And he knew I was interested in the same things, and so he brought me to Paris for a summer as a research assistant. It was really out of that initial working together, or my working for him as a research assistant, that we then wrote our book, The Embodied Mind. That was in many ways kind of parallel to all of my academic training. Well, really, I had known him before I even went away to college, and then wound up working with him as a graduate student.
That's really interesting. I am familiar with the Lindisfarne Association, although I have to admit that I was never able to read Gregory Bateson. I mean, I just found his writing impenetrable. Maybe I could read it now. Maybe I'm more used to reading hard stuff. But back in the 70s, when I was college age, I found it too dense. But at any rate, the embodied mind, my impression, because I've covered embodied cognition several times over the last few years, is that it's one of the foundational texts of the movement. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think that is fair to say, in the sense that when the book came out, as I said, we started writing it in 1986. It appeared in 1991, and it was one of the first books. It wasn't the only one, but it was one of the first ones to really identify this movement of embodied cognition and to present it in a way where it was a logical development within the history of cognitive science out of earlier periods of work that we called cognitivism, or as some people know it, the computer model of the mind, and then connectionism or neural network research. This was the milieu in which we were writing, and we wanted to push the ideas further to point towards the importance of the body and the embodied context of cognition, the way the body shapes our perception and our action. And as I say, we weren't the only ones to do this, but we were, I think, one of the first books to try to pull a number of different threads together in the emerging interest in embodiment and to give it some kind of conceptual, theoretical framing that then I think did prove to be useful for people, for researchers. And so it has come to be identified as one of the, early foundational statements of that movement. Yes.
Is it in that book that the idea of the enactive approach first appears?
Yes, that's right. So we used the term enactive at that time to point towards a particular way of thinking about the importance of embodiment. And that was a way of thinking that emphasized that the mind isn't an inner theater where you receive sensory impressions and they get translated into a representation in the head, and then you produce some kind of motor output that leads to some behavior. That rather cognition, particularly perception, is an active process, or enactive as we called it, that depends on having a body with certain kinds of sensory motor skills and habits. We use the term enactive really to signal that idea. Over the years since then, that term has become more refined and more precise in relationship to the general movement of embodied cognition. But the embodied mind was where that approach was first put forward. So nowadays you will see the term enactive used to signal a particular orientation within the embodied cognition movement, if you like, which not necessarily all embodied cognition theorists would share, but which would be recognized as one particular way of articulating the embodied cognition approach. What I tried to do in my more recent book, Mind and Life, is really actually to develop more precisely those enactive ideas.
Great, and I want to get into that in just a minute, but to continue putting these ideas a little bit into the historical context, especially for younger listeners, in both of your books, because I know you do this in Mind and Life too, you describe the difference between embodied cognition versus cognitivism and connectionism. Cognitivism, that's basically what's meant when people talk about the cognitive revolution. That was a reaction to behaviorism, correct?
That's right.
So it was like the behaviorists acted as if the brain didn't matter, and then the cognitives came along and put everything in the head. This is kind of my take on it. They put everything in the head. The connectionists came along and said, well, the computer model doesn't work. You need a neural net model. But they were still putting everything in the head, so everybody was ignoring the body. So then along comes embodied cognition. And then the enactive approach also says not only is the body important, but then there's that whole interaction, or the body isn't active, the mind is active. Is that a fair characterization of where we're trying to go?
That's right. So I would say that, to simplify, there's maybe two important threads. So one is the thread that you just identified in the narrative that you just gave. And then the second way of articulating that would be to say that the conception of the mind, or what we think the mind is and what we think the mind does, that ran through cognitivism and connectionism was a representational conception. So the idea there is that mental processes are ones where you manipulate a representation in the head of the outside world. And the enactive approach, and many embodied cognition approaches in general, challenged that kind of representational thinking and pointed rather to the way that the cognizer, or the cognizing agent, the animal or the person, if you like, the way that the agent interacts with the environment and isn't a passive representer of the environment, but actively shapes the environment in a way that makes it meaningful for that kind of agent. So it was a movement away from representation towards action or interaction.
That would mean that every animal's world, I think you used the phrase, which of course is not original to you, of the Umwelt, every creature's world will be not some abstract representation in their brain, but directly a result of their particular body interacting with the world.
That's right. That's right. So every type of organism, or artificial agent for that matter, if you're thinking in terms of robotics, would have its environment, its lived world, we could say, to use a phenomenological term, that is going to be a reflection of the kind of bodily structure that makes up that kind of being. So the way the world is perceived, the way it's acted in, the way it's conceptualized is going to depend on the bodily structure and capacities for action that that body has. If you wanted to formulate it in terms of a hypothesis, so for example, this is the way that Lawrence Shapiro puts it, which I think is a nice way to put it, is that the embodied cognition hypothesis, or working assumption, is that the way we cognize the world is strongly shaped by the kinds of bodies that we have. And so correspondingly, the way that other creatures or agents cognize the world is going to be strongly shaped by the kinds of bodies that they have.
As a non-philosopher and non-neuroscientist, that seems very sensible to me.
Yes, I mean, I think from a biologist's point of view, I think it's a very intuitive idea. It's not terribly startling. And of course, the idea of the Umwelt goes back to Jakob von Exkel and the foundations of ethology in the early 20th century. But it's important to remember that cognitive science in its cognitivist form, and even into its connectionist form, was often pursued very independently of biology. She was really seen, at least on an extreme view, as just a mere matter of sort of implementation details, that what was really important was the software, not the hardware.
But then when the roboticists started trying to build stuff, they realized that that just didn't work.
That's right.
Evan, is there anything else that we need to talk about before we move directly into discussing your book, Mind in Life? Do we need to talk about phenomenology before we jump in there, or can we just make that part of that conversation?
We can make it part of that, but maybe one thing that would work as a kind of carryover from one part of the discussion to the next is that we also, in the embodied mind, tried to point to the importance of complementing cognitive science with a phenomenological perspective on what it's actually like to experience having a mind, what our lived experience as bodily beings is like. In the embodied mind, we did that particularly around issues having to do with the nature of the self, and so we drew a lot on Buddhist philosophy and phenomenology, which is very insightful around the understanding of the self. But that's a thread that was unique to the embodied mind among the other embodied cognition works of the time, and it's a thread that carries over into Mind and Life, where phenomenology, particularly now in the form of Western phenomenology, which we gave somewhat short shrift to in the embodied mind, Western phenomenology becomes very important for me in Mind and Life.
I want to take a few moments to tell you about an exciting new approach to the problem of climate change. As I've watched the signs of climate change accelerate over the last 30 years, I've often wondered whether there's anything I can do that will really make a difference. If you are struggling with this question, I encourage you to visit ren.co. Here's how it works. You answer a few lifestyle questions to calculate your carbon footprint and learn how you can reduce it. You can also sign up to make a monthly contribution to offset your footprint by funding projects such as planting trees, rainforest protection, and carbon removal projects. You'll get monthly updates and get to see how your money is being spent. You can learn more about the projects at ren.co/projects. It will take a lot to end the climate crisis, and you can start helping today by learning more at ren.co/brain science. If you sign up using ren.co/brain science and tell them I sent you, Ren will plant 10 extra trees in your name. Well, what is phenomenology, and why would there be such a thing as Western phenomenology?
Well, phenomenology, in the most general terms, is the study of experience, you could say, from the point of view of experience itself. It's the attempt to describe what our lived experience is like. And when I use the term Western phenomenology, that's somewhat artificial in a way because the word phenomenology, after all, is a Western word. But I mean to identify a particular tradition within philosophy that was very concerned with understanding the structure of consciousness, of conscious experience, and then in some of its phases with embodiment, with what phenomenologists call the lived body. So these would be thinkers like Edmund Husserl and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So these are German and then French philosophers of the early 20th century. And in the embodied mind, although we looked to Merleau-Ponty very much as an inspiration, we were somewhat dismissive of Husserl in ways that I later came to see were not correct. And so I tried to correct that in Mind and Life. So in the embodied mind, we drew, as I said, more from Buddhist thinking, which is also very phenomenological in the sense that it's concerned with our experience and what our experience actually feels like. Say, for example, in the embodied mind, our concern again was with the sense of self, what it feels like to have a self. So in that general sense of the term, it indicates a concern with the importance of taking account of experience in our understanding of the mind. This really, I think, became very clearly recognized as an important issue in the 90s with the whole explosion of the interest in consciousness. And that was an explosion that, happened in neuroscience with the neuroscience of consciousness. It happened in philosophy of mind. So there's a number of ways in which phenomenology then becomes especially important when we're trying to get a handle on the nature of consciousness.
So, by definition, phenomenology takes the position that subjective experience and consciousness matter. They're not epiphenomenon.
Yes, from a phenomenological perspective, you could say in a way they have a kind of primacy in our knowledge because they're the phenomena that we know most immediately and intimately, and they're the basis upon which we are able to do anything, including science. So all of science depends on observation, and observation depends on consciousness. So the idea that consciousness could somehow be marginal or epiphenomenal from a phenomenological standpoint really doesn't make sense.
Let's get into talking about mind and life. And of course, we'll talk more about phenomenology and neurophenomenology as we get into that. Evan, do you want to start by just kind of giving us a brief overview of what your intention was with this book?
Well, the core idea of the book is really that we can trace a continuous path from the emergence of life into the emergence of mind and the emergence of consciousness and subjectivity in the sense that we know it from our own experience. In order to do that, I tried to weave together material from cognitive science, from neuroscience and psychology, particularly from the embodied cognition perspective, and even more particularly from the enactive perspective that we had developed earlier in the embodied mind. I tried to weave those elements together with a phenomenological account of the structure of our experience of perception, of emotion, of bodily experience, and also then thirdly with material from evolutionary and theoretical biology. So it's those three strands, I suppose, of biology, the sciences of mind or cognitive science, and phenomenology, phenomenological philosophy that I tried to weave together into this story, you could say, about the emergence of life and mind and consciousness traced all the way through into human intersubjective or social consciousness, which is where the book ends. A guiding idea through the book is the idea of self-organization. So I draw a lot on notions coming from the study of self-organizing systems in biology and also in neuroscience to some extent. And I try to show how the tools that come from the study of self-organizing systems are very illuminating for an understanding of cognition and perception, and also have echoes, you could say, in aspects of our own experience and how it organizes itself in time as a kind of flow or stream of consciousness. So the book covers a lot of ground, but that's in very, very general terms what the book is about.
Obviously, we can't really do all those three strands the justice that they deserve. I think I'm going to probably concentrate mostly on the embodied cognition and how that interacts with the phenomenology for today. And then I promise you that in my closing comments, I will give my listeners a sense of what the other aspects of the book are like, especially since listeners have different backgrounds and will be interested in different aspects of the discussion. I personally have a deep interest in embodied cognition, how it relates to emergence and dynamic systems, but I'm not sure exactly where to start because it seems like those are so interrelated. You've already talked about the fact that embodied cognition implies an active involvement in the world and that the mind is embedded both in the body and in the environment. So what about the issue of autonomy? Because that seems to be one of the things that really sets your discussion apart from some of the others that I've read.
Yes, so I would say that the notion of autonomy or of autonomous systems is really, in a way, one of the distinctive notions of the enactive approach within the larger setting of embodied approaches. So let me say something about what we mean when we use the term autonomous. An autonomous system is one that, in a sense, creates itself through its interactions with its environment. The paradigm example, and in a way the best understood example of an autonomous system, is a living cell. If you want to think of it at say, the simplest, so-called simplest level of a single bacterial cell. What a cell does is that it constantly makes itself as a unity, and it does that through internal metabolic processes, so internal chemical reaction networks that produce or synthesize their own components, among which are the semi-permeable boundary or membrane, which houses all of the reactions, which in turn create themselves and create the membrane boundaries. So the whole thing, through a kind of bootstrap or recursive or self-referential process, constructs itself so that it emerges as an individual in a dynamic relationship with its environment. When I talk about emergence and autonomy, that's the paradigm case for me of getting a handle on what we mean. So to come back to just the term autonomy, I mean, literally it means self-governing. So there's a sense in which a system like that is not externally controlled through inputs and outputs, but creates itself in such a way that its inputs are always a function of what it's doing, of its outputs. So there's a constant way in which it holds together in a self-organizing manner that makes it have this individuality and directedness in relationship to the environment, so that some things, if we're thinking of the cell again, some things are meaningful or significant for it and other things aren't. So that a bacterium, will swim in a certain way up a sucrose gradient and away from other things noxious. So this is really what I mean by autonomy.
You mentioned the semi-permeable boundary. Now, an autonomous system, by definition, doesn't need to have a boundary, right? So this actually brings us to a special type of autonomous system that you talk a lot about in the book.
Yes. So here we need to distinguish between what we call autopoiesis, which is a term that is used to refer to specifically the kind of biological or biochemical autonomy at a molecular level that we see in a living cell. So the example that I was just going through is one of a system that's autonomous, but it's autonomous in a very special way. It's autonomous in an autopoietic, which literally means self-producing way, where it produces itself as a bounded molecular system. Now, in principle, you could have other autonomous systems that have an individuality that they create themselves, but that isn't bounded in that molecular way. So, for example, the nervous system is distributed throughout the body, but it doesn't close back on itself in a bounded way because, of course, it's within the body that is providing the organismic boundary. But it has autonomy in the sense that all of the processes close back upon themselves in the mathematical sense of closure. That is, any effect or any process within the nervous system is the result of at least one other process in the nervous system, and of course actually many, and also gives rise to other processes in the nervous system. So there's a way in which the system kind of is like a snake biting its own tail. It closes back on itself. So that's really the core idea of autonomy, is that kind of closure. And autopoiesis, the molecular cellular form, is a paradigm of that in the sense that it's one that we really have an awful lot of knowledge about. We can see it in a very concrete and detailed way.
So if we, for the purposes of discussion, accept the premise that autopoiesis is an essential quality of living things, and you did mention in the book that Varela had talked about this as far back as 1979. So it's not exactly a new idea. It's just one that people are coming to appreciate more now that they have the tools to deal with the math and all. But you mentioned the importance of it being thermodynamically far from equilibrium. Why is that important?
Thermodynamically far from equilibrium means that there are processes going on where there's a constant exchange of matter and energy across the boundary. In the case of a cell, in a way where that is actually altering the boundary conditions of the cell itself. So the cell, in taking in materials and excreting materials, is constantly altering its immediate environment in a way that keeps it going as a locally reduced form of entropy. Far from equilibrium is a very, very general notion, of course, that holds for candle flames and vortexes of water and many kinds of dissipative systems. What's more, I think, important, at least for the enactive approach, is the special form that takes when you have this kind of closure that is the closure of autopoiesis or of autonomy. So far from equilibrium thermodynamics is really, it's a very, very general framework.
But something like a vortex requires an external application of energy. It's not self-producing.
Well, it's self-organizing, but of course all self-organizing systems depend on energy from the environment.
But there is a sense in which life is different from something like a vortex. That's what I was trying to get at.
I see what you mean. Yes. I mean, there's many differences. One is that the living cell, in terms of the molecular species that make it up, is far more heterogeneous than a vortex. And as a result of all of the ways that those molecules can interact among themselves, they produce self-organizing dynamics that's very different from a candle flame or a vortex. And one of the differences is that they strongly alter the boundary conditions of their own individuality, so that the cell is adaptively regulating itself, changing itself in relationship to local environmental circumstances in a far more complicated and rich way than a candle flame or a vortex.
But then is this whole autonomy and autopoiesis the beginning of how self emerges?
In the case of autopoiesis, the kind of autonomy that belongs to the living cell, I see that as where we really can start talking about individuality in a way that marks a difference between the living and the non-living. It's not a hard and fast difference. Of course, there can be boundary cases and blurry cases, but just in terms of the concept, the kind of individuality that we have with an autopoietic system, where it produces itself and regulates itself adaptively in relationship to an environment so that some things are significant and other things aren't. It's the first case of an individual with a milieu or an Umwelt or an environment, and that then carries through for the rest of evolutionary history all the way to us. So it marks, I think, a very important point of emergence in trying to understand the precursors, if you like, of mind and cognition.
Yeah, it seems to me that once we've got a self, subjectivity is sort of implied.
Well, that's a very tricky question. Some philosophers have certainly, and scientists actually, biologists, have wanted to argue that already in the case of a cell, we have a kind of subjectivity or proto-subjectivity. I have some sympathy for that. I mean, it's an open question, but I would prefer to say that in the case of a living cell, we have the emergence of a kind of, this is another term I use in the book, a kind of sense-making individual, a kind of being for whom certain events in the environment are significant and others aren't. And if you just were to look at the world from the perspective of physics, you would miss that. And that sense-making is then a critical precursor for subjectivity. If we use the word subjectivity in the sense to mean the feeling of being alive or the feeling of having a self, well, I think probably that might be imputing too much to the back.
Right, I see what you're saying.
I wouldn't say that it's to be just automatically shut down, but we tend to think of that as requiring the kind of complexity and organization that comes with the nervous system.
But still, the approach that you're discussing here really emphasizes that there's a deep continuity between life and mind. And then, according to Damasio's current way of thinking of it, mind's been around a long time, consciousness not so long, but that it's all a continuity.
Yeah, I think I certainly, in my book, am trying to present an account in which there is that kind of continuity of mind and life, yes. And so in that sense, I'm sympathetic to Damasio's way of formulating it.
I want to take a moment to mention our longtime sponsor, Text Expander. What can you do with more hours every month? Repetitive typing, little mistakes, searching for answers. They're all taking away precious time. With Text Expander, you can take that time back so you can focus on what matters the most. You just type a few characters to trigger your snippet, and the content expands wherever you type. It's that easy. If you want to learn more about how to use Text Expander, you can go to textexpander.com/blog. I literally use Text Expander every day, and I really appreciate that Text Expander is available on Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad. Brain Science listeners get 20% off their first year. Just visit textexpander.com/podcast to learn more. That's textexpander.com/podcast to learn more and get 20% off your first year. And don't forget to tell them that you learned about it on Brain Science. Before we talk a little bit more about the phenomenological, I want to just touch briefly on the relevance of dynamic systems theory as it relates to autonomous systems. Assuming we take the point of view that life is a dynamic system, and so therefore the nervous system is a dynamic system, what are the implications of that?
I mean, I would prefer to see dynamic systems theory as really just one tool that we have for trying to understand autonomy and for trying to understand emergence and life and mind and so on.
What I'm trying to get at is, as a tool, it brings out some important aspects of the system because they are important aspects of dynamic systems, such as the relevance of time.
Yes. So for looking at processes that are intrinsically temporal, that is, that are what they are because they unfold over time, for trying to get a handle on systems that are highly nonlinear, that is, that are very sensitive to initial conditions and can diverge in their behaviors along different pathways as a result of very small differences in their initial conditions, that are also resilient and adaptive in response to perturbations and fluctuations in the environment, that also depend critically on noise as a source of adaptivity. That's sort of the home of dynamic systems theory in science, is trying to characterize systems of that sort. So it's natural to draw on dynamic systems theory to try to get a handle on autonomy in a way in which, say, traditional computational tools coming from the computer model of the mind really weren't so helpful for.
Yes, and that's a key point that I was trying to get at. For example, the fact that inputs and outputs in that sort of static sense that they exist in computation just don't fit dynamic systems, and they don't fit life.
Yes.
You made a real interesting comment in the book that really struck me, and you were talking about metastability and the fact that that's what makes it possible for the system. This, I think, is almost a quote from your book. The system can generate its own content and even change its state without outside control. And since that really fits what we're now learning about what the brain is really doing, I found that really caught my attention.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting work that's being done on metastable, you could say metastable dynamical regimes and their application to the brain in different areas. And one of the features of a metastable system is that it doesn't really have states in a classical sense. It has rather transients. That is, it initiates a certain process and moves towards a behavior that it looks like it's going to settle down into some regularity in, but then it doesn't ever really arrive there. It moves off again towards another pathway and then moves back. And so it's always in a kind of transient mode and never really settles down. And a number of theorists have pointed to this as a potential source of adaptivity and you could even say creativity or also resilience in the face of a constantly changing dynamic environment. So I'm thinking, for example, of work by people like Scott Kelso at Florida Atlantic University, who works a lot on motor control and neurodynamics. Carl Friston in London has written a lot about metastability and the nervous system. This was a theme that was very important to Francisco Varela in the very last years of his life, around 2000, 2001. So it's a very promising idea. I mean, the way I dealt with it in Mind and Life is really, in a way, you could say more speculative, but there's a lot of promise to the idea, I think, in research that's being undertaken in different areas.
Well, some of my listeners are students who might be ones that might figure out more about this in the future. You never know.
I hope so.
I want to move into the issue of cognition. I think there was a quote from one of Varela's co-authors presenting the idea that living systems are cognitive systems. Where do you come down on that?
So the expression he used was living systems are sense-making systems. The reason he chose the word sense-making is because if you say living systems are cognitive systems, then, immediately people are going to think, well, a bacterium isn't cognitive in the way that, a human being is cognitive. And he wanted to have a more general way of talking about how the organism already at the very beginning of life creates a world of significance. So I'm sympathetic to wanting to put it that way, that is, in terms of sense-making versus cognitive. But if we're using cognitive in a very general sense to mean being able to behave in an effective way or in an adequate way where the behavior is a result of one's own individuality as a complex self-organizing system. So that's a very general sense in which we could use the word cognitive. Then I think it's fair to say living systems are cognitive. In a cognitive science context, people usually want to say something more restricted when they use the word cognitive. So then it might not be so helpful. But there it kind of becomes a verbal question.
What I liked about it was that it sort of emphasizes one of the themes of your book, which is that there's that deep continuity between life and mind in that action sense.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I would put it now, I think, is I would say living systems are sense-making systems, and cognition is a kind of sense-making. Cognition in the more restricted sense that, we would use the term in cognitive science. So the important thing there is that when we put it that way, we're emphasizing the continuity, and we're also emphasizing that cognition as a form of sense-making isn't best understood according to the old representational model of input, representation, output.
I want to ask you just briefly about the question of subjectivity. Obviously, you argue in your book that subjectivity, if we're trying to understand consciousness, is something that we can't ignore. So is this where you feel like phenomenology comes in?
Yes. When we want to understand subjectivity, or what philosophers sometimes call phenomenal consciousness, that is consciousness in the sense of felt or lived experience, then I think phenomenology becomes unavoidable because the phenomenon that we're trying to understand is one that has to be described from a subjective point of view in order even to have a sense of what the phenomenon is. And the job of phenomenology, or one of the jobs of phenomenology, is to get some precision and clarity about the description of subjective experience from within. If we want to be more concrete about it, suppose as cognitive neuroscientists we're interested in understanding the neural systems or processes that are critically important for our having a sense of self. By sense of self, I mean a lived experience or feeling of self. Well, in order to know what forms that lived experience or feeling of self can take, we need to have a phenomenological account of our self-experience to guide the neuroscientist in even knowing what to look for. So this is a way in which neuroscience and phenomenology can work together. But it means that phenomenology is critically important, you could say methodologically, for getting a handle on the very phenomenon that we're trying to understand and investigate when it comes to subjectivity.
To just give an oversimplification, perhaps, you're talking about a method for creating first-person data?
I would say a method for enriching the information that we have about consciousness or about our subjective experience. First-person data is one way to put it. I sometimes use that phrase, but it sometimes can invite misunderstanding because people then think, oh, it's some kind of special hidden inward data. And I don't really mean that. I mean that it's information that we gain or that we acquire through a careful investigation of experience from the first-person perspective. So in that sense, we could call it first-person data.
Well, I think we're unfortunately running out of time, and we've just barely scratched the surface of your fascinating book. What have we left out that you really think we need to mention?
We've covered a lot of ground. I suppose maybe I would say that one of the things that I'm working a lot on now and that really emerges in, I think it's actually the third part of Mind and Life, is the idea of neurophenomenology, which is what I was just talking about, which is putting together a phenomenological investigation of consciousness with a cognitive neuroscientific investigation. And the book that I'm working on now, a new book, is based really on a neurophenomenological investigation or exploration of consciousness. So I would just maybe point to that as one of the forward-looking or future-looking steps of this thinking, at least for me, and that I think has gathered interest from other groups and other people as well, is this idea of a neurophenomenological investigation of consciousness.
By that, you mean combining the phenomenological approach with neuroscience?
Exactly, but doing it in a way that's much more methodologically rich and developed than what's been done up to this point. And by that I mean using phenomenology to actually devise various kinds of neuroscience experiments, and then in the neuroscience experiments working with individuals who are able to report and describe their experience with some precision, because most of the experiments we do in psychology or neuroscience are done on our first year, undergraduate students who have to sit in the lab and run the experiment for a course credit, and not to put them down at all, but if we want to really plumb the depths of human consciousness, working with individuals who maybe have some more experience with systematically investigating and describing their experience, that's something that I think could advance the field.
Yeah, and you have some excellent examples of that in the book that I'll refer listeners to. Is there anything that you just like to sum up with that you'd like to leave my listeners with?
It's a very exciting time for this kind of work. The embodied cognition movement in cognitive science is not a fringe movement anymore. It's very well established, and it interacts with other perspectives, including older, more classical perspectives in very fertile ways. And the work that's being done on consciousness and subjectivity and psychology and neuroscience and bringing phenomenology into that investigation and also bringing in things like methods of mind training or mental training from meditative traditions. I mean, all of this is really just getting going. So it's a very exciting time. So for younger listeners or for students, it's a great time to be in this field.
So I always ask my guests for advice for students, and I want to ask you a specific question, and then if you have more general advice, you can give that too. But when I have interviewed older philosophers of mine, say, for example, like Patricia Churchland, she mentioned that the reason she went into philosophy was because at the time she was coming along, science wasn't ready to address the question of consciousness, and that was what she was interested in, or even mind, really. And that's changed. Now consciousness is becoming a legitimate area of study for neuroscience. So how does a student decide whether they want to go, for example, because I have students doing both, into philosophy versus science?
Well, I think that's really, in many ways, that's a very pragmatic decision. And that is, when you go to graduate school and then, you get a research or a teaching position, you need to ask yourself, what is my home base going to be? Am I mainly interested in reading philosophy, writing philosophy, and talking to philosophers, even if I'm also doing it in concert with people in cognitive science? Or do I want to be an experimentalist? Do I want to be in the lab, in the culture of a lab where it's very much teamwork and running experiments? So part of it is almost a temperamental difference. What kind of life activity intellectually do you want to have as your home base? And that's just going to differ depending on the individual. I would say, though, that more and more there are programs in philosophy and also in neuroscience and psychology where you can, have your home base in one of those disciplines and really learn the craft of that discipline while interacting quite extensively with people in other disciplines. And that wasn't possible 20 or 30 years ago, and it's really much more becoming the norm. The two key things, I think, for a student are where are you going to be most comfortable intellectually in terms of your home base? And then secondly, go to a program or go to a university where there's a culture of interaction with other disciplines and other departments.
Well, those sound like two key pieces of advice. Thank you. This interview with Dr. Evan Thompson from the University of British Columbia was originally recorded and aired almost 10 years ago, back in the fall of 2012. I chose it as an encore episode for two reasons. First, it was very popular with listeners when it first aired, and because I wanted to give newer listeners a sense for the diversity of episodes available to premium subscribers. The first 2 years of Brain Science, which was from December 2006 through December 2008, contains a lot of basic neuroscience. But as the show matured, I began to mix up the technical level, and it is fair to say that this is one of the more challenging episodes. However, my goal is to make these more challenging topics accessible to listeners of all backgrounds. I'm going to review the key ideas, but if the concept of embodied cognition is new to you, I encourage you to check out the show notes for links to additional episodes and resources. As I noted before and during the interview, Dr. Thompson was the co-author of one of the pioneering books about embodied cognition, The Embodied Mind, which was originally published in 1991. In this interview, we talked about Thompson's follow-up book, Mind and Life. I also talked to Thompson again in 2015 when he published another book called Waking, Dreaming, and Being. That is episode 115, which is available to premium subscribers. In this first interview, I enjoyed hearing about how Thompson met his co-author, Francisco Varela, when he was a teenager and then had the opportunity to work with him when he was still a student. We started our conversation by reviewing some of the key ideas from the embodied mind. The key concept of embodied cognition is that our mind is shaped by our body and the way it interacts with the world around us. We are not passive recipients of sensory information. Perception is shaped by how we move in the world. Dr. Varela and Dr. Thompson chose the word enactive to emphasize the importance of action. As Thompson said, cognition, particularly perception, is an active process or inactive because it depends on having a body with certain kinds of sensory motor skills and habits. According to Thompson, the enactive approach has two important threads. One is the idea that the mind has an active or interactive relationship to the body. The second key idea is that the mind is not representational. That is, the mind is not acting on some representation of the world that exists in the head, because the mind of the animal or person is not a passive representative of the environment. So the enactive approach is a movement away from representation toward action or interaction. I mentioned the term Umwelt, which is a term coined in the early 20th century to represent the idea that every animal's experience is a direct result of how it interacts with the world. For example, the world we inhabit is very different from that of our dog because The dog's world is dominated by smell, while ours is usually dominated by sight. Thompson quoted Lawrence Shapiro, who I interviewed back in episode 73, as describing embodied cognition as having the working assumption that our cognition and interaction with the world is strongly shaped by the kinds of bodies we have. One of the problems of the early approaches of cognitive science, that is, computationalism and connectionism, was that they both tended to be pursued independently of biology. We also spent a bit of time talking about phenomenology. In the context of embodied cognition, phenomenology points to the importance of subjective experience. What is it like to have a mind? While phenomenology might seem rather esoteric, the main theme of mind in life is not. As Thompson said, the core idea is that we can trace a continuous path from the emergence of life into the emergence of mind and the emergence of consciousness and subjectivity. One of the guiding ideas that runs through his book is the idea of self-organization and how using the tools from the study of self-organizing systems can help us understand cognition and perception. We talked briefly about autonomous systems. Thompson defined an autonomous system as one that creates a self through interactions with its environment. We really didn't have a chance to emphasize how important this is in terms of understanding why the mind is different from the computational model envisioned by early cognitive scientists. But we did talk about autopoiesis, which is a special kind of autonomy exemplified by a living cell. An autopoietic system is one that creates its own boundary. This matters because now we have the beginning of a self long before the emergence of awareness. I wish we could have spent more time talking about how the use of dynamic systems theory relates to autonomous systems, but we did touch briefly on the fact that dynamic systems theory is a tool that allows us to get a handle on systems that are non-linear, that is, systems that are highly dependent on initial conditions. Living systems are dynamic systems, but this is also what allows them to be resilient and adaptable. Thompson mentioned that dynamic systems also depend critically on noise as a source of adaptability, which led us to a brief discussion of metastability, which is actually a key feature of living systems, and especially the nervous system. Thompson talked about how a metastable system never settles down into a state in a classical sense, but rather moves from one transient to another. The reason this is important is that it explains how the nervous system can produce its own spontaneous activity rather than being dependent on external inputs. Returning once again to the theme of continuity, when I asked Thompson about cognition, he said, I would say living systems are sense-making systems, and cognition is a form of sense-making. If we look at cognition as a form of sense-making, it isn't best understood according to the representational model, which is input, representation, output. However, it is important to note that Thompson does not propose that all life is conscious. On page 162 of Mind and Life, he wrote, it is important to situate consciousness in relationship to the dynamic unconscious processes of life regulation. This effort becomes difficult, perhaps impossible, if one projects consciousness down to the cellular level. I want to make a few more comments about the book, Mind and Life, Biology, Phenomenology, and the Science of Mind. It's not light reading, but I do think it's a must-read for students of neuroscience, and especially for those who are interested in philosophy of mind. I particularly recommend this book to those who have some familiarity with embodied cognition, because you'll find that this book takes the discussion to a much deeper level. Thompson mentioned that Mind and Life has three threads: a discussion of the enactive approach to cognition, a discussion of phenomenology and neurophenomenology, and also a discussion of the evolution of the mind. In this interview, we focus mainly on the first thread, but I want to mention that the book contains an early chapter on emergence of the mind that I think is one of the clearest I've ever read. This book was also my introduction to phenomenology, and episode 123 explores that topic in more detail. Finally, we didn't touch on evolution at all, though it is a very important theme that runs through Mind and Life. I'd especially like to mention Chapter 7, which is entitled Laying Down a Path in Walking, Development in Evolution. I could easily devote a whole podcast to this chapter, but I only have time to mention that this chapter includes a detailed attack on what Thompson calls the genocentric approach to evolution, which is the approach promoted by writers like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett. One reason that Thompson attacks this approach is that he feels that, like computationalism, genocentrism perpetuates the dualisms of hardware versus software, matter versus information, body versus mind, etc. The enactive approach championed by Thompson is more compatible with what is known as developmental systems theory. Developmental systems theory is an approach to evolution that sees the life cycle as the fundamental unit of evolution instead of the gene. Thompson also says in this chapter that, according to the enactive viewpoint, natural selection is an emergent consequence of autopoiesis, not its cause. So he sees the emergence of the autopoietic cell as the central event in the origin of life because it represents the transition to basic autonomy and thus from non-life to life. This viewpoint proposes that self-organization and natural selection are not opposed, but actually interwoven aspects of a single process of enactive evolution. Of course, he notes that similar ideas have been proposed by other writers like Stuart Kauffman. This is certainly one of those times when trying to summarize a book is rather inadequate. But I hope I've given you a sense of how Mind and Life fits into our ongoing exploration of the brain, mind, and consciousness. Thompson sees a deep continuity between the emergence of life and the emergence of mind. So he doesn't feel that there's another level of explanation required. Even so, some of you may feel that this discussion has generated as many questions as answers, especially if you're new to these ideas. I recommend checking out the show notes at brainsciencepodcast.com for more episodes about embodied cognition, because there's no way that I could make this episode totally standalone. But don't forget that the episode for this encore version is also free. If you use the free Brain Science mobile app, you can access the transcript there, but it's also available at brainsciencepodcast.com. As always, I would love to hear from you. You can email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The deadline for submitting content to episode 200 is August 31st, 2022. Please consider signing up for my free Brain Science newsletter so you can get show notes automatically every month and get the free gift, 5 things you need to know about your brain. Sign up at brainsciencepodcast.com or text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. If you want to support Brain Science financially, go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. You can learn more about the premium subscription as well as Patreon. Even if you can't support Brain Science financially, you can help by remembering to share it with others. Brain Science is available wherever you want to listen, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, Spotify, Pandora, and even on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again next month. Brain Science is copyrighted by Virginia Campbell, MD. You may share the show with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please write to brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com for permission. The theme music for Brain Science is Mind Fire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.